Thanks for coming this morning, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And it is otherwise my pleasure to introduce Mei Lin NEO, who has come to Vancouver because she had the incredible fortune and challenge to present a TED talk on her research. And we had been communicating because we had done some work on a paper basically summarizing research on giant clams. And so I suggested that she come and give a talk here at UBC. And she gladly accepted the invitation, which I'm very excited about. So Mei Lin NEO is a research fellow at the Tropical Marine Science Institute in Singapore. And she's been in that position for the past 2 years. She's completed her PhD and most of her research in Singapore and has increasingly been collaborating and networking with people throughout the region on giant clam research, so looking particularly at functional ecology and also increasingly on conservation. So what means are being used and what activities are being undertaken to protect an endangered species, or endangered species in a plural rather. So without further ado, I would like to welcome her and let her present her research.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So I'm suffering a little bit from the sore throat that I've accumulated over the last 2 weeks of traveling around BC. So thank you, Colette, for the introduction. So I've made a long journey from Singapore all the way to Vancouver 2 weeks ago to give a TED Talk. And it's only a 5-minute TED Talk about my research. I was selected as one of the TED Fellows for the program, and that gave me the opportunity and the platform to speak to the TED audience. But instead of giving a 5-minute talk, I've expanded it into this talk today to share a little bit more about what I've been doing and why I'm so obsessed with just the giant clams. So from this picture, can you find or spot the giant clam? Maybe you're not, or yes or no. So one way to spot this clam is not just by the diver itself giving a scale, but also this particular area here that you see where I'm standing up here. It's actually a siphon. So a siphon about the size of this, which is almost maybe slightly bigger than the size of my fist. So what you're seeing in this entire picture is the giant clam itself. And this is the true giant clam species, which is the world's largest living bivalves. The largest recorded species is actually 4.5 feet long, and that weigh about 550 pounds. And an interesting fun fact is that that's almost as heavy as 3 baby elephants. And this species, basically there are 12 different recognized species in the world, in 2 different genera, Hippopus and Tridacna. So it's actually a very small group of animals. And they are actually, another characteristic is that they are very long-lived invertebrates, which means, and they can live up to 100 years old on coral reefs, which makes them actually very useful indicators of coral reef health. Some other fun facts about them: they are actually what we call simultaneous hermaphrodites, which means that they possess both male and female sexual organs at the same time at maturity. So these animals actually mature at 2 different phases. And in the first 2 years of their life, they mature as a male, which means that they can actually donate sperms during a reproductive spawning event. And later on, 7 years later, they actually, the female organs actually mature, and that makes them a egg donor for the reproductive spawning event. So what happens is that the eggs and sperms would be released into the water column, and they actually externally fertilize. So on this area that you see, this is actually a brief life cycle of how, a typical bivalve actually, but in terms for the giant clams, it lasts approximately 9 days. So it basically takes 9 days for to become a giant clam, from something that's about a size of 100 micrometers to about 200 micrometers, and that's a giant clam. Something else that I like to call them is they are solar-powered animals. They are actually, so what this means is that they actually obtain nutrition in 2 different modes. The typical way of bivalves, filter feeding in the water column for phytoplankton, and the other is actually through the billions of photosynthesizing algae that lives within the tissue body itself. So actually that itself has been hypothesized to explain why these animals potentially grow to such large sizes compared to their typical bivalve counterparts. I'd like to share something interesting as well, as legends actually once described them as man-eaters. They would lie in wait on the seabed to trap unsuspecting divers. So this is actually an ongoing legend, and there's even actually a book that is titled Eaten by a Giant Clam. But the story basically goes that a diver, a pearl diver actually, went down to retrieve a giant clam pearl, and he got trapped, and basically he apparently lost his legs while trying to retrieve this pearl, which is being held in the hand of this free diver itself, which has been found to be untrue. The account itself is untrue, but what's interesting and that still boggles me is that the pearl is a real thing. The pearl is actually known as the pearl of Allah, and you actually can search about it online, and it is actually derived from a giant clam shell. So go figure if it's really a real story. But unfortunately, the real threat is actually humans, us. They have been considered a delicacy throughout the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans, where they are usually found, and they have been traditionally fished as seafood. And the fishermen would usually go for a particular part of the body, which is called the adductor muscles. So it's an organ that basically holds the two shells together like a hinge. And that particular muscle is highly prized in many areas, and maybe particularly the Asian cuisine. So in the early 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of these adductor muscles were exported to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China as in a form of scallops, actually. A more recent exploitation is that the clam shells itself, they are considered very valuable in the ornamental trade. And one of the examples I like to highlight is the South China Sea crisis. So what has happened in this part of the world is that the Chinese fishermen actually went out of their way, all the way to South China Sea to harvest fossilized clam shells from the seabed. So basically it's considered seabed mining, and they mine like large quantities of these fossilized shells, which are brought back to mainland and carved and sold as so-called ivory handicrafts in the Chinese market. So this is one of the largest sort of clamshell market that is ongoing in China itself. What's interesting is that during my survey and my trip to this part of Hainan Islands, you see that actually some of the carvings resemble elephant tusk ivory, which could be a symbol of wealth, strength, and power in terms of the Chinese culture. Some of the other carvings include dragons, cabbage, which means wealth in Chinese, some of the religious symbols, motifs, as well as the arowana, which is also a fish or a symbol of wealth for the Chinese culture. So with all these threats, given all these threats that are happening to them, and like sort of a step back, is that I started to ask myself, why should people care about conserving giant clams? And that got us started on a research, which is to accumulate a comprehensive review that demonstrates that giant clams are actually important ecologically to coral reefs. So these multitasking clams they basically are food sources to a wide variety of predators. Some of these predators include the crabs, the jawed fishes. In fact, like octopus, sea stars have been recorded as well. And not just big predators, but really tiny predators like the snails and flatworms have been also recorded to feed on these animals. They are also providers of shelters in terms of like the presence of the animals itself. They basically become a three-dimensional swim around for fishes. We've seen fishes laying eggs on the surfaces of the shells as well. So it could be perhaps for shelter, or it could be perhaps due to a hydrodynamic flow of water which would encourage or enhance the survival of these reef fishes. But not just the outside of the animal, but inside the animal itself as well, houses a variety of different animals, such as this squat lobster, also the shrimps, as well as pea crabs. And these animals are exclusively only found, some of these animals are exclusively found only living inside the animal, inside the clams itself, and nowhere else. So you can see that this is actually a tenuous relationship, and the importance of keeping one species will also protect the other species downstream. As well as reef builders and shapers in terms of like the production of calcium carbonate shells. So apart from corals, this is also the only other animal that I can think of that produces such large quantities of calcium carbonate, which is also the foundation of reef frameworks. And other aspects, for example, are related to the microalgae, which is the zooxanthellae, which is photosynthesizing, and they themselves become reservoirs of multiple different types and strains of symbionts for the reefs. And because they are such large, possibly large filter feeders, they could potentially counteract against eutrophication. So some of this, this is based on review, and actually my lab and my colleagues are actually picking out some of these roles to develop experiments to quantify it with numbers. And in my head, and I imagine how a giant clam would be like on coral reefs, is that they are literally clam condominiums. And this is really a nice drawing, and I really loved it because like it not only shows the clams put like, you know, row on reefs, but you can sort of like peek into like a little clam and see like what lives inside them. So earlier on, Colette mentioned about the collaboration that we did, and we were looking into the developing a very comprehensive review and of the idea of what do we actually know about them now, and is there anything that we can do to conserve them better. So in this review, we showed that they have been recorded in at least 66 different localities, and localities refers to islands, and countries itself, or even regions, for example. So some areas where it's a little bit hard to define, for example, like the South China Sea itself, we define it as a locality in this case. And this is only based on literature review, that's what's been recorded, what's been interviewed, and based on emails and really a lot of correspondence with people to find out like where do we know giant clams exist. And in actually 25% of the localities report at least one locally extinct species. And just to give you an example, in Singapore we have 2 locally extinct species. And we're actually, although we're really a very small country, but that's actually quite a high local extinction rate. And from the review itself, it is not surprising as well. The larger species, such as the Tridacna gigas, which is shown in this picture, and the second largest species, which is Tridacna dorasa, are the most endangered species. Not surprising because of their size and just because of the value of actually extracting the larger individuals compared to extracting the smaller giant clams. Excuse me. So from this review, we also showed that clam fishing remains the major threat. And clam fishing, both in terms of the traditional fishing versus the commercial fishing as well. So in this case, we're not differentiating them, but collectively they are presenting the biggest threat to the giant clams now. There are also other like some upcoming threats that includes coastal development in terms of like this one. I can give you a very good example back home again as well in Singapore. So what has happened to our small little island is that we've been doing a lot of coastal reclamation and land reclamation to increase the land size area, and that includes also reclaiming some of our islands. And in that process of reclaiming islands, we basically destroy reefs and we bury clams and coral reefs and everything else. Not a good thing, but we're trying our best to reduce that in terms of more communication with our stakeholders and policymakers now. Pollution, and as well as global warming, climate change. Very recently, just last year, or in fact the last 2 years, the global phenomenon of coral bleaching, not just coral bleaching, but it also affects other animals that also possess the photosynthesizing algae. So the same thing for giant clams as well. And last year, I think there are a couple of instances where areas have been reporting giant clam bleaching as well. So I'd like to share a little bit about the review that we did as well of like the existing frameworks or existing solutions to mitigate against the loss of the species. So firstly, yeah, they can be categorized into three different components. Firstly, the international obligations. Secondly, local legislations. And thirdly, how giant clam mariculture can also help promote conservation of the species. So I'll go through each of them very briefly, just to give you an idea. In terms of international obligations to protect the species, there are two frameworks and two agreements actually. So firstly, the very first one that developed when the species was known to be endangered is basically the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. So when the species were being over-harvested between the 60s and 80s, people or the specialists from IUCN actually picked them up and actually produced this document to elaborate about their current status as well, but also to assign the known species at that time with a conservation status, which I'll show you later. But this is a really very old record. And it requires updating. So if you go to the IUCN website, you'll realize that the last update was 1996. That's about 21 years now. And this is something that I'm trying to do as well, and I'll share a little bit later. The other one that comes shortly after the IUCN is actually the CITES agreement, which is an international agreement which controls the trade of species between different countries. And they are currently listed in Appendix 2. And so in CITES, there are three different appendices, 1, 2, and 3. So in the order of 1 being the most protected and 3 being the slightly least protected. And they're in the middle, which means that the trade is controlled and closely monitored, but will basically, unless the species tips over into extinction, for example, or like at the risk of being extinct. So, but the problem with CITES, or the caveat here, is that it really only works across boundaries between countries or between potential parties that have signed the CITES agreement. The problem is a lot of it is a domestic market. So the earlier example, that I showed in South China Sea, it is largely driven as a domestic market. So CITES in this case cannot be applied very effectively. And unfortunately, although CITES does control the trade of wild caught species, but at the same time, we still see wild caught species in the trade. So this is another big problem. Like, this is in terms of like managing the information and updating the trade volumes in the different countries. Some of these local legislations apply in places like the Pacific Islands, where clam fishing is still an active trade, and people actually harvest them as for consumption. So some places, for example, they place temporary fishing bans. They only fish them at a certain time of the year, and that sometimes it may also overlap with the seasons of the place. For example, typhoon storms that would stop them from going out for fishing, and they only fish during periods where they can go out for fishing. There are also increasing number of bans on commercial harvest, but that's also debatable because there are also some illegal commercial harvesting, no-take reserves, and I think the most effective one so far, seizing illegal harvesting vessels, but by the time they actually seize them, a lot of clams are already dead. Usually, these illegal fish harvesting vessels, they come from, some of the more recent examples are like they come all the way from China, Vietnam, and they go all the way to Great Barrier Reef, or in fact even east part of Malaysia, Sabah, to actually fish out really large quantities, and they make the long journey back, but in the journey back, they actually got caught by the Coast Guards, and they just found like tons of shells and tons of meat. Sometimes not just giant clams, but they also have turtles, and as well as corals as well. So these conservation measures or legislation measures, they vary from site to site. And I think they highly depend on not just funding, but also community involvement as well as the willingness of community parties to work together to ensure that the natural resources still exist in the years to come. So this article that I pasted here is actually a very recent one in 2014 in Taiwan. So there are recreational divers and fishers that would go down and pick clams, but with the increasing number of recreational fishers and divers, they are picking a lot more clams now. So what's happened is that in this county in Taiwan, they are actually facing a fine for people who are seen with giant clams. But this will only work if there is also the corresponding policing around the areas where fishers, like clam fishers, are known. Lastly, a little bit about mariculture. So the term mariculture is agriculture, farming of giant clams in ocean systems. And this is a method that has been done or has been carried out over the last 30 years to 35 years. There have been, so the top picture which shows 34 giant clam hatcheries since 2014. So one of my collaborators and friend, Gerald Hessinger, he has been working with the giant clams for the last 40, 50 years. He started with them and now he has started a company to actually also promote them as sustainable ocean farming species. And in this talk that he made, he basically said that there are actually that many farms active, but at the same time, I think I found another article recently saying that like maybe some of them are not not sustainable. Yeah. So while these places are saying that they are doing the cultures, but in terms of the long-term yield, the production and the cost of like running such farms is actually very, very high. And although that's said, we still have some sort of beacons of light where it suggests that mariculture and restocking of reefs with giant clams can help sort of promote the next part of conserving the species. So for example, just this year, the Filipinos have been working on the giant clam mariculture for the last 25 years. And around that time in the 1985, 86, they started transplanting about 40,000 individuals to various parts of Philippines. And just 2 years ago, Professor Ed Gomez, basically he shared with me that the outcomes of their study, which is that these transplanted clams are actually producing their own little babies now. And some of these babies, well, they're not that baby, they're about this size, about 30 cm. But like being able to see younger giant clams on the reef was like a hope for them that this method can work, but it does take a very long time, which is about 25 years, before you actually see populations being able to self-sustain and self-renew itself. This has been one of the few examples. There is also another example in Yap, where another species is also shown to sort of self-renew itself after the restocking program. But in terms of the successes, it's a few. There are definitely a lot more failures in terms of reintroducing the species, and there are various reasons why it didn't work. In terms of sustainable funding, so like given that they're such long-lived species, and this example itself says that it takes 25 years. Like sometimes I like to laugh at myself saying that these animals would live much longer than myself if I can see them through to their 30 years. I'm already 30 now, so that's quite a long time. By the time my first baby clam will reach that reproductive size. So what I've described so far have been basically methods that have been done. Some of them are ongoing. But I'd like to share with you a little bit about what I've been doing to try and enhance this process of conserving the species through understanding the ecological aspects of the species, as well as also a little bit more of using different research tools as well. So these are little baby clams that we have, or like we reared them in Singapore. So this is the fluted giant clam species. It's not very, hopefully not very, well, hopefully a little bit clear with you on this side with the shells. You do little tiny flutes, like little fingernails. So this is the reason why they're called the fluted giant clam. So one of the things that I did as an undergraduate, so I've been studying this species or these animals for 10 years. I started as an undergraduate in my second year, and I've never stopped studying them since. Because they are such fascinating, interesting animals, and every time I study an experiment, it just, like, there is the next question that I start asking myself, and curiosity just drives me to answering more questions, and now refining it to how some of these answers or to my questions can help me conserve the species better. So going back, I started a lot of my work with understanding the larval behavior. So what you see here on this side is the very early larval stage, which is the swimming stage of the larvae. Not very clear from this picture, but you can see the little velum or the flagellus that are sort of outside the mouth of the clam, so that allows them to swim around. So they have the ability to swim around for approximately 2 to 3 days. And on this side, you see the later larvae, which actually has a foot. So hopefully you can see. Let me see if I can find it here. No, it's not. So you can see that one projection. So that is a foot. I think that's what's interesting about the species is that people think that they can't move, but in fact, I'm going to show you that they can move a lot. This study, basically what I did was I introduced a very common chemical cue on coral reefs that induces settlement of marine larvae. So it has never been done for clams. It's been done for abalone, it's been done for worms, it's been done for corals, but then no one's really figured out like if it works for giant clams as well, or what triggers a giant clam to find a spot on the reef. And basically this study shows that in the very early stages where they can still swim, they actually are actively searching for the cue itself, which is called which is also known as the crustose coralline algae, which is a very common algae, encrusting algae on the tropical reefs. But what happens in the later stage is that like the cue itself no longer is attractive to the larvae, because by then they develop a foot, and this foot allows them to search on the surface for something else. So they are no longer looking for the cue, but in this instance they are looking for a suitable refuge and shelter to stay there for a very long time before you start to see them appearing as little clams on the reef. So this experiment and this behavior experiment shows that there are 2 phases to actually understanding how they actually settle on the reefs eventually. Now the more exciting part. This is a complete coincidence. A senior of mine did his study on the giant clams' aggregation behavior. So then later on we start to ask ourselves, wait a minute, how do they aggregate? Like, what actually is triggering this aggregation? So I'm going to show you this video. So what you see here is actually clams placed on a grid. And you can see that we made an effort to actually deliberately put them very nicely in rows and columns. But what happens after 24 hours is that you start to see them whoosh, come together in a clump. And that itself is an aggregative behavior. And we found that actually one of the individuals overnight could walk approximately 30 to 40 cm. Like if you have a chance, like there is a video on YouTube, you will see one of the individuals actually going around like in a big circle, but kind of coming back to where he started. So that was very interesting as well. We have no idea what he was doing. But basically all this is driven by the presence of a foot. And this foot actually reduces in size with time and with size as well. So as they grow bigger, there's no longer the need to really move that much. That's why people actually say that they are sessile for life. But actually, if we look at the different part of their life cycle, this part of walking behavior is very important as a young giant clam, because they will be searching for somewhere safe to adhere before they become this big, where predators are a lot lesser than when they are this size or even that size. So we got one of our students to actually look at an experiment to determine how aggregation is the pros and cons of aggregation in terms of the costs and benefits. And we just submitted the manuscript. We're still waiting to hear back from the reviewers. But basically, he found that he did experiments to look at predation, and he did experiments to look at growth and susceptibility to parasites. So the good thing is, when they are in aggregated bundles, they are more resistant to crab predation. The crabs have problems really trying to like sort of anger their healers to try and like grab the clams. So when they're in a bundle, they actually protect each other. So that's quite interesting because if you think of a terrestrial example, that's like a social herding. So that kind of protects like the central parts of the central clans or central animals versus the ones in the surrounding. But there are also disadvantages of living in very big groups. And it's very typical of bivalves, of bivalve groups such as mussels and oysters, which are known to aggregate anyway. But for them, it reduces growth, that's one, and it increases the transfer of parasites, and that's a bad thing as well. So this information actually is useful in terms of like mariculture work, because that means that people actually have to spend a lot of time trying to separate them. Or maybe people are actually wondering why do they always come together and then the next morning they have to separate them again. Yeah, so this could actually help them understand that, guys, maybe it's just okay to leave them alone in bundles. They'll do just fine. Another interesting experiment I did was squirting. It's also very random, and so one of the things I did as a student was cleaning clams every day, sitting in the tank. So while I clean them, they actually just squirt water at me all the time. And I just started to ask myself questions like, can they see me? Can they really squirt a very accurate jet of water? And the answer is maybe. So I did this experiment. Well, I only showed you the successful hits on the fish target, but there are more that are not successful. So like I have multiple videos to actually try and quantify the pressure, the strength, and also translate it to an underwater jet to see if it's actually, good at deterring predators. And we conclude that yes, it does give a scare, but it probably doesn't have that effect of like really pushing back the predators. But that itself, if you observe how fishes and marine animals sort of interact with giant clams, you could see that motion actually scares the potential predators as well. So to some extent, this is a useful deterrent. In terms of this, how I'm using this information is that when I transplant them on the reefs, I want to know if they have a good chance of survival. And so for this experiment, what I did was I actually measured from various size classes of clams, and I actually did a plot, like water jet pressure versus the size of clams, just to see how, what is a suitable escape size for transplanting giant clams. So this is it. This is a very recent work that I did, and it's also really by chance. So my colleagues at the Center for International Law back home in Singapore, they had a project looking at the South China Sea areas. So the example that I gave earlier. So what happened is that they started to look at satellite maps, and then they realized something is not right. They started to see a lot of curve marks, and it's very systematic. It's really like very interesting, like fingernail marks. And they started to ask. We had this conversation. We started talking about it, and we later discovered that actually these are dredging marks, and these dredging marks are actually approximately 10 meters wide. So although on the satellite image it looks like little tiny fingernails, but actually in terms of the scale it's approximately 10 meters wide. And we're wondering why they were doing this. And so this picture briefly shows you like they're basically doing seabed mining for fossilized clam shells. And what I really like about this collaborative work with them is that, like, as a scientist, I can see how my work and my knowledge, the earlier knowledge that I presented on their behavior, their functional ecology, can be applied to a framework like this. And we basically just submitted a paper to one of the coastal law journals, and we'll see how it goes from there. So some of the recommendations that we have in this paper is a moratorium. So basically a no fishing for, I don't think we actually indicated a fixed time, but basically no fishing of giant clams in the South China Sea, as well as uplisting the species, particularly Tridacna gigas, which is the species where they are harvesting the shells from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1, which is the CITES that we talked about. And in Appendix 1, basically, that's almost a complete ban of the trade of the species. And I think one of the things that we highlighted in this paper as well is that the caveats for CITES as well, because the agreement only works on international boundaries, but we want to be able to work on this on a more localized scale. For example, starting with the South China Sea, hopefully. Something that I'm doing right now is to use molecular tools, like functional character traits, as well as extinction risk matrices, and combine them into a framework where we can better develop management ideas to reduce the biodiversity loss. So there is an argument which is we started with the EDGE, which means the evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. So this is a very interesting framework, and this idea I got from my senior who works on coral reefs, and I'll show you the results that he had. So basically, what I'm hoping to do now is using the phylogeny, looking at how the species, the evolutionary patterns of the species itself based on geographic locality or even based on the species itself, combine it with the extinction risk, which is currently using the IUCN classifications, and then combining these two together to basically get ED and GE together to get the scores, and then hopefully identifying what species traits or what species is, or in what location is at a higher risk of extinction. So there's I know it sounds complicated because I sometimes confuse myself as well, because I'm trying to add a lot of different factors into this framework. But the idea is being able to merge different aspects of research, for example, phylogenetics, molecular phylogenetics, the functional ecology, as well as modeling into this study to try and develop more accurate conservation indices. So an example that my senior did, and this is when he first started the work, and now he has developed it even more, so I'm actually still in the process of learning it from him. So he basically looked at the threatened coral reefs of the world, and he published it in PLOS One in 2012, and he basically used the same indices that I talked about earlier to categorize which coral species is in need of protection more urgently, where are they usually found in terms of where the more threatened species of corals are found. For example, is it in the Caribbean, is it in the Pacific, is it in the Indian Oceans, for example. So that gives us a good idea of where we should try and concentrate our conservation resources. I think one of the things that in terms of conservation, I can acknowledge is that funding is limited. And with this type of framework, hopefully we're trying to narrow it down to places where we can actually be more effective in directing this funding and resources to. So this is just an example, and he's developed this since then. But yeah, I'd like to share a little bit about the caveats. And one of the examples is the 1996 IUCN status of the species. And since then, there's also three more described species. I don't have the 12 species because that species I think we're still figuring out if it's an actual species. But basically, there are few species that have been described in the last couple of years that have not been assessed. And one of the major problems is that, for example, this species here actually has been mistaken to be the blue species for the longest time. And more recent molecular genetics work have definitively separated them as two different species. And some of the early preliminary surveys have showed that one of the species is more dominantly found in one area and vice versa as well, which means that we've been always mistaking them for the same species and we're not conserving them properly. So perhaps one species has been more overexploited than the other, and that's a problem. And we need to know what species is what at this stage. There are also several knowledge gaps I'd just like to bring across very quickly. They are all relevant in terms of like the whole framework that I've been talking about. So for example, in terms of restocking, like putting them back onto coral reefs, we need to know how many and what density. How do we spatially arrange them? In terms of, and that itself, we need to look at the reproductive methods, like how they actually reproduce effectively on reefs. And that's still a longer standing question. No one has actually, okay, I will take that back. I have not seen a natural spawning of giant clams. Unlike broadcast coral spawning, we know the time of the year, we know where they would spawn. But for giant clams, we have simply no idea when they'll go off, where, and how many. So there's still a lot of like question marks here. So this is the one that I talked about. Looking at using molecular tools now, I think the earlier molecular work has always looked at they have tried to look at the connectivity and relationships between populations, but now with more different molecular markers, we are able to actually more distinctly separate them and be able to more strategically like get an idea if a region is more important for protection, or do we need to expand these boundaries in terms of larval dispersal, considering the hydrodynamics dispersal of larvae. So not just looking at a local, but regional and globally. This is interesting. We actually still don't have a very good phylogenetic tree of how the species are arranged on on a tree. There are some species that are so closely related that, like, depending on where the samples are obtained, the positions of the positions actually kind of like play like the musical chair. And this is something that I'm hopefully trying to re-establish by not just using molecular work, but hopefully integrating functional ecological traits as well to try and see if we can more distinguish the species' position on trees better. And looking at fossil records as well. That's something to add on. And I think the last question is, it's always an ongoing question. How are they going to be adapting to the new environment that we have now? Not just climate change, but development, pollution, etc. I've always found populations of giant clams in Singapore really interesting. Not only that they are countable, but I know most where they are, like the 63 of them, I know where they are on the reefs. But apart from knowing where they are on the reefs, but given that like our reefs are so impacted, we still have clams. And that itself is a small hope, because we can learn a lot from this small population and see how they actually have adapted or become resilient to ongoing threats. And I mean, I'm not proud of it, but we have destroyed almost 60% of our coral reefs due to development. But at the same time, there is hope that we can try and remediate some of these problems through understanding the existing species and existing populations' resilience. So I think the bottom line is, I think that we need to use a multidisciplinary approach to conserving rare species like the giant clams. I think this can be applied to other species as well. But for me, I think for me it's the giant clams. And just to reiterate what has been talked about in this talk, but also to include like genetic information, evolutionary relationships, and biophysical modeling. These are some of the up-and-coming approaches to conserving the species. But there's going to be a lot more, and not just a lot more, but integration and merger of some of these techniques. And to be honest, like, there is really not many reef animals that have so many ecological roles such as the giant clams. And through the review that I did, basically it shows that like when you conserve giant clams, you potentially conserve other species that comes along with it as well. Just like coral reefs as well. So, but you know, these are unique species to the tropical parts of the reefs. And hopefully we still have time to save at least the larger species, because the larger species is, I think, more than 50% of the different locations that we reviewed showed local extinction. And local extinction means from 0 to possibly just one individual of the entire area. So with that, I thank you for your kind attention. And you feel free to contact me. I'd like to acknowledge that the research was supported by National Parks Board, which is our local environment agency that provides funding for the restocking and mariculture work that we've been doing in Singapore, my university and the different labs that I've been working with, and Tropical Marine Science Institute, where I've been doing my research